Alrighty. So now we're going to start talking about, this is going to be our first conversation about a way that we can create depth in a drawing. Because when we talk about drawing, we are essentially thinking about a way to create an illusion on a 2D surface. Now, there is lots of ways to do that. There's lots of ways to create the illusion of space or the sensation of depth. But the one we're going to talk about today is something that's known as relative scale, or sometimes it's called relative size. It's known as a type of non-linear space. And essentially what that means is we're not focusing on line or like perspective, in the sense that like if you think about perspective in like railroad tracks going back into space, and as they go back into space, they get closer and closer together, right? That's a line. So that's linear perspective. We're thinking of it in a little more fluid sense, and it's more about how we use size of objects, where we place objects, how objects sit in relationship to each other. So those are all types of non-linear space because it's not using line. So relative scale is how we use size, how we use the size of objects and how they sit on the picture plane in relation to each other, and how that creates depth. So essentially, the objects that are closer to us, right, are bigger, and the object, as they get further back in space, they will get smaller, okay? So it's about, has a lot to do with shrinking. As things get back further away in space, they shrink. When we are kids, right, we have trouble understanding that idea of the illusion of space. We can't quite kind of cognitively relay it yet. So we kind of draw everything on the same picture plane. And what I mean by like drawing everything on the same picture plane is everything kind of sits on the same line, right? So even though I know that this figure is bigger than this figure because they're taller, and this figure is taller than this figure, there isn't any space, depth in the image because all their feet are on the same line, right? And that's kind of the way we start out. And then we start to get maybe a little bit more advanced as we start to think about foreground, which would be this family, and background, right? So the house. So this is actually where we start to think about the illusion of space and creating a sense of depth. And then using that depth, we start to kind of add narrative. So this is what's known as relative size or relative scale. You can call it either way. But this family, right, just like the other family, is all on the same picture plane. All of their feet are on the same space. But this house here, we can tell it's in the background because it's much smaller. And so because of the size, we know that it's far away from the people. Because logically, right, we understand that this person couldn't fit in this house. So that, and because of that, we understand it to be far away. So there's just a sense of scale there because of size variation. So if you think about just kind of relating to it on a much just formal level, right? If everything is the same size here and also on the same level, okay, there's no size variation and no depth, okay? Whereas here, things are varying in size, but because they're on the same plane, there's no depth, right? Whereas here, things are different sizes, and then they're also on different picture planes, right? They all have their own picture plane. So there's size variation and depth, which is how we start to get that illusion that things are moving back, is by having that sort of sensation of shrinking as well as different picture planes. So they have to work in tandem. So here you can see, right,
So Ruth, can you go back to that slide for just one moment, please? Because the second one that says all on one picture plane, there is size variation. So I see that there's a size variation, but I also see that that to me is slightly going back into a different picture plane. So to me, it does look like that there's depth. Now, it's like the angle is very slight, but if they were all touching the same line at the bottom, I'd say there's not. But even just that slight bit, to me, looks like there's depth.
There is a slight bit here. It's very subtle.
Right.
I just couldn't find a graphic that was like actually totally straight. I need to go into Illustrator and change it all.
Okay. Okay, so I just don't want to think I'm somehow missing the boat, because I think that you're saying one thing and I'm thinking that's not my perception. So
no, you're not. It's just it's a bad image.
Okay, so that's fine. That's fine. I get it.
Yeah. So you're actually more perceptive than needed, I suppose. And are my captions still on? Because I can't see the captions.
Yes, they are. Thank you.
Okay. So this is Painting by Degas. And this is a really good example of nonlinear space because it's showing the relative scale, how this figure is the largest. And as these ballerinas go back in space, they're getting smaller. And they're all sort of like, this is on this sort of picture plane that's closest to us. And then these ballerinas in the middle are sitting on this sort of middle picture plane. This grouping in the back is on another picture plane back here. So they're all kind of sitting on different picture planes. But another thing that is being used here is something known as overlap, where it's super helpful. And this is probably the simplest way to create space, is that another way we can tell this ballerina is in front of this ballerina is simply by the way she is overlapping her, right? So we understand her to be closer to us because her arm is over her tutu. Or this instructor, we understand them to be in front of this group because he is overlapping them as in front of them. So it's just a matter of layering in order to create a sense of space. So it's another way to create that sense of space. So here, diminishing, right? Getting smaller, different picture planes, creating space that way. And then as well as using overlap with this bottle to create the sense of space. And then here, this bottle sort of fits in between these two because it's sort of an intermediary size between here and here. So because of that, right, we start to understand the space of the image and how it creates depth. So there is all of this space and this illusion of depth happening in this image, even though it's not like an architectural linear perspective. And then here, this is a huge scale shift, right? This is really big. We can tell it's really close to us, whereas this is very small, so it feels very far away. So it's just giving us a sense of depth. These are just some more examples. So essentially, when we're talking about relative scale, we're just talking about how objects, as they go away from us, they appear as though they're shrinking, right? They get smaller. And that kind of shrinking effect just makes them look as though they are further away. So biggest, foreground, middle ground, background. Foreground, and sometimes you have to use logic as well, because we understand here that this figure could not possibly fit in this house. And if they existed in the same, on the same plane, if this house exactly as it was moved up here, it would be like a doll's house, right? So by moving it back, if that is a real home, it would be huge. And then you can also use it, doesn't have to be real life objects. This could be more abstract, but these shapes are still going back into space. As they go back into space, they're getting smaller. And then this is more of a linear perspective, right? So this linear perspective that I was talking about is like where this floor is diminishing as it goes back in space. The lockers, the sort of hallway, how all these squares are moving to a singular point, and we'll talk about that later. But then the people, right, are more in relative scale because they have that sort of sense of shrinking. Now, your exercise is going to be on relative scale, but I also just want to talk about some other ways to use scale. So scale, when we talk about scale, we are talking about the relationship of objects to one another, right? Which is actually different than proportion. So proportion is, if I was to talk about only this glass, and I was talking about the proportion of the top of the glass to the bottom of the glass. So if, say, the top of the glass was like huge, right? And then the bottom of the glass was teeny tiny, right? Then that glass would be out of proportion. But since it's feels like it's, you know, the sizes are correct, then it's in proportion. So things can only be out of proportion or in proportion when you're talking about singular objects. They can only be in proportion to themselves for the most. And then scale is in relation to other things. So when you're playing with scale, you're talking about how you are playing with items in relationship to each other. And you can do that for lots of different reasons. It can be very, like, these are surreal. And a lot of times surrealism plays with scale a lot because it creates a certain sense of absurdity through the contrast of the items, and it will kind of shift the narrative. and create a sense of playfulness. So by like contrasting scale, right? So the Leaning Tower of Pisa and a spoon creates almost like a non sequitur. It creates like a very absurdist, dreamlike experience by having the spoon sort of like prop up the Leaning Tower, because you're enlarging the spoon to like a ridiculous degree in order to do that. And then in this image, by enlarging the comb and enlarging the shaving brush and enlarging the wine glass, you're really playing with hierarchy. So you are shifting and telling us what's more important than other items by how you're using scale. So I know that the comb and the wine glass and this pill are more important than the bed and the wardrobe because they are bigger. So it just gives me a sense of like what I should look at first and what's more important. Other ways you can use scale, you can exaggerate things, right? Make things that are typically small, huge, and it gives a different sense of narrative, particularly when you're putting them in relationship to like landscapes or things that are like normally super vast. So you're flipping the narrative in a way, flipping our understanding of objects. You can create a sense of emphasis, right? So this, if these items were normal sized, right? If she was holding a normal cup of coffee, I would just be like, oh, she's drinking coffee, right? But since the scale has shifted and I understand that, man, she really loves this coffee. She must really need it. So it's changed my understanding of the narrative of this artwork because of the way the scale is working. So you can use scale to create a sense of narrative. And then another way, this is a sculpture. Another way you can use scale is just by making something really, really big. Like if you make something really, really big, it becomes like almost overwhelming and sort of absurd simply based on its size. So it takes on a different sort of context because something is like so big, as opposed to something that we're a little more used to. So it just has you're just like shifting the context by shifting the scale of it. So it's just another way to use it.